I am here to tell you a story that will torture your thoughts by day and poison your dreams by night.
The emptiness will haunt you.
This story is about a hunter, a frontiersman, a trapper, and even a pirate. But it was none of these things which would make Hugh Glass an undying legend of history. But before we open the vault, you've got to subscribe, like the video, and comment for the algorithm. But I'm not going to waste your time with all of the super important things that make these videos possible, so let's just open the vault right now. This is the insane story of Hugh Glass. Now, Hugh Glass was born in the beloved little town of Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1783. Now, 1783 being just 7 years after the founding of America and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I don't need to spend a huge amount of time describing to you what kind of world Hugh Glass was raised in, because everybody is, of course, very familiar with early American history. You know what I'm talking about, the time when anarchy reigned supreme across the wild, wild west, and people spent their time at home hunting and farming, while in the meantime fighting pirates on the seas and Native Americans on the land. Life was, in every way, both very difficult and very challenging for Hugh Glass, as he was raised in the small little town of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And this wasn't even because the paper company he worked at was facing downsizing and economically struggling.
I declare bankruptcy!
Okay, I promise, that's the only office joke. This is a serious matter. Listen up. So anyway, not a lot is known about Hugh Glass's early life, but what we do know is that sometime in his early 20s, he was actually kidnapped by pirates. And when this happened, Hugh was actually given the option where he could just die, or he could just join the pirates on their raids and their murderous plundering ventures. And so, with really no other choice to make, Hugh became a seafaring pirate. And he would spend the next few years of his life out on the high seas, plundering villages and stealing treasures. And he was even once cursed by a gold coin to where he could never die, and then he had to sail to the edge of the world for some reason. Okay, I'm just kidding. That last thing didn't happen, but the other stuff did. This is a very serious story. So while Hugh Glass was a pirate captive, he kind of went along with what the pirates wanted, and he would go on their plundering raids and do all of the stuff that they asked. But deep down, Hugh had absolutely no interest in being a pirate. In fact, he really actually hated his pirate life. And he was always looking for a way to escape and try to figure out a way to get away from the pirates, but being trapped on a ship most of the time, and every time he would go to shore, he was surrounded by all the other pirates, and there was really no way for him to get away. But still, that didn't stop him from looking for ways to escape and get off and live on the mainland. In fact, it would later be discovered that while Hugh was on the pirate ship, he would actually write these following words in his personal journal. The reality of being a pirate far topped any horror, any vision of the trade possible to one who has not been immersed in it. There are monstrosities of conduct belonging to a society which has cut itself off from honor and compassion that outsiders can only understand at the price of forced association. So yeah, I guess that's what I'll be thinking about when I'm dressed up as one later this month. But fortunately, after more than 2 years of captivity living on this pirate ship with these pirates, Hugh and another sailor who was also a captive on this pirate ship would make an escape. One night, when the ship was sailing not too far off of shore, Hugh and his friend would just sneak their way to the back of the ship, and they would just jump off into the water and start swimming, making their way towards shore. And after hours of swimming toward shore, taking periodic breaks by swimming on their backs and then turning back around and swimming back to shore, eventually Hugh and his friend would make it to the shores of Texas. And so there they were on the beach, exhausted and tired after their long swim and after their years of captivity, but they had made it. Hugh and his friend were finally free of pirate captivity. But of course, this wouldn't last long. You remember how I said in the early days of American civilization, people weren't only fighting pirates on the seas, but they were also in conflict with the Native Americans on the land? Well, you guessed it. After getting to shore, Hugh and his friend would spend a couple weeks trekking their way through Texas, hunting and scavenging for food and doing whatever they can to survive while they're looking for civilization. And eventually they would actually make it into Kansas, where they would be spotted and captured by a group of Pawnee Indians. Now, since you never missed a history lesson, I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait, weren't the Pawnee Indians actually allied with the Americans? Like, didn't they help the Americans fight against the Lakota and the Cheyenne tribes? And while yes, you would eventually be correct, in 1819 or 1820, which was the time that Hugh and his friend came across the Pawnee Indians, no such alliance had yet been made. All the Pawnee Indians saw was two strange white guys trekking right through essentially their backyard. And honestly, what is anybody to do when they come across two trespassers? Of course, you would want to take them in and gently burn them alive. And that is not a joke. I actually do mean gently, because this was no burning at the stake or tossing people into a bonfire. Instead, what the Pawnee Indians did is they took Hugh and his friend back to their camp, and they took off all of their clothes, and then they hung them upside down by their ankles. And then Hugh was forced to watch as the Pawnee tribe gathered all around that friend and started poking little twigs and little pine needles into his flesh. And they continued to poke him with little twigs until his body was literally completely covered up in pine needles and twigs. But this wasn't death by 1,000 cuts or anything like that. Once they had completely covered his body with pieces of dead forest material, they all gathered around and they set him on fire as a type of ritualistic human sacrifice. And so as all of this is happening and his friend is literally being burned alive, Hugh is hung up upside down by his ankles just watching all of this happen. And then as he's watching this happen, he sees all of the tribespeople pick up a bunch more twigs and pine needles, and then they look over at him. And just as all of these Pawnee Indians are gathering around him to burn him alive, Hugh thought fast and he began to bargain with these Indians, telling them that he could give them furs and teach them how to hunt. And luckily for Hugh, this strategy worked. The Indian chief would actually let Hugh down, and he would once again spend a few more years in captivity with the Indians this time, teaching them different ways to hunt and how to gather furs. But unlike his time in captivity with the pirates, Hugh actually didn't mind his life with the Pawnee Indians because he was in his element hunting and gathering. And as time went on, Hugh began to learn the Indian language and began to really adopt their style of life, to the point where it really didn't feel like he was a captive so much as one of the tribespeople. And it would seem that these Indians began to think of him as more of one of their own as well, because after 2 or 3 years of spending time with the tribe, Hugh would decide that it was actually time for him to go, and he would be allowed to leave freely, so there was some kind of trust between him and the tribespeople. So after leaving the Pawnee Indian tribe, Hugh would make his way to St. Louis, and this is where our story really begins. You see, after making his way to St. Louis, Hugh decided that he needed to make some money, and this is when Hugh would see an ad for the Rocky Mountains Fur Company. They were looking to hire frontiersmen and hunters to go up to the Missouri River and to collect beaver pelts to use in trade, because these beaver pelts were often sold to Europe, where they would be used in hats and gloves and other clothing items. And since Hugh was already an experienced frontiersman and hunter, and he already knew the language of the Indian tribes that lived in that area, it was no surprise that Hugh thought that this opportunity was perfect for him, so he would eagerly apply for the position, and of course, with all of his experience, he was quickly accepted for the position. So along with a few other frontiersmen like himself, Hugh would head up to the land of the Ikara, which is now somewhere in present-day South Dakota. Now once again, I know I don't have to tell you this, but for the one person out there who forgot to memorize all of the very specific Indian tribes and their location of territory and which ones were allied and enemies with the Americans, I will let you know for the sake of this video that that area around present-day South Dakota was territory of the Lakota tribe. And the Lakota were not necessarily friendly with the Americans. Like, they weren't unfriendly, it was more of a like, you stay out of our way, we'll stay out of your way, and if we ever see you, we're just gonna attack and kill you and all that kind of stuff. I mean, come on, it was the 1800s. That's just what people did. And this was just kind of how it was, but everybody knew that this made hunting and gathering expeditions in this area relatively dangerous because you never knew when you were going to run into the Lakota tribe and might have a confrontation with them. And sure enough, on Hugh's very first expedition, when they were heading up to the Missouri River to go get beaver pelts, they would come face to face with some Lakota, and a massive fight would end up breaking out. In this confrontation, 10 of the men that Hugh was with would actually get killed, and more of them would get wounded, and actually Hugh himself would end up getting shot in the leg during this fight. But of course, this was just a flesh wound, so he would pull the arrow out of his leg, and after a few days of recovering, he was back up on the mountain, hunting and gathering beaver pelts. And for a time, everything was going wonderfully for Hugh. They hadn't run into any more Lakota, and eventually Hugh would find himself on a very rugged expedition through very treacherous territory, going up to the Yellowstone River. But it was what happened to Hugh on that expedition, which is why he's in our story today. You see, he was walking through this rugged terrain with a group of men, but they didn't always stick together as a group, and at one point Hugh would actually find himself ahead of the group in a section of the wood by himself, when all of a sudden Hugh heard a loud noise like branches breaking next to him. So immediately Hugh would turn around to see a huge grizzly bear charging directly at him, and the bear would throw him on the ground and immediately jump on top of him. And Hugh did everything he could to fight back against this bear, but there was really nothing he could do as the bear began to bite into his arms and legs and head. And in this attack, Hugh would suffer massive injuries all over his body, including at one point when the bear would turn him over and dig its claws deep into his flesh. But that wasn't the end of it. In a moment when the bear had gotten off of him for a few seconds, Hugh was able to grab his gun and shoot the bear once. But this shot wouldn't be fatal, and the bear would attack Hugh once again. And this time was worse because Hugh was now on his back with his face looking up at the bear, and this time when the bear attacked him, it began biting into his throat and attacking the front of his body. And still, Hugh was doing everything he could to fight this bear off just using his hunting knife. Now, I should tell you at this point that some reports say that Hugh actually killed this bear with that knife, and other reports say that his friends came up behind and they shot the bear with their guns. But either way, Hugh survived this attack, but he was in horrible shape. He had suffered terrible wounds that would leave his body bloody and broken. When Hugh would even take a breath, the air would bubble out of his neck where the bear had bitten into his windpipe, and even part of his scalp had been ripped off of his head. And when Hugh's friends got to him, they realized that he was in terrible shape, and they didn't even know at first if he was still alive after this attack. But after listening, they could tell that he had a heartbeat, but they only had rudimentary first aid supplies, and this was nothing that they were equipped to handle. And not only this, but they were more than 200 miles away from the closest civilization, and there was just no way they could really do anything to help Hugh. So Hugh's friends decided that there was really nothing that they could do for him, but they didn't want to just leave him there, so they figured they would make camp there, and then they would just sit with Hugh for the next couple hours and figure that he was going to die sometime during the night, so that they would just make their camp, spend the night, and then move on without Hugh the next day. But to everybody's surprise, Hugh didn't die. He faded in and out of consciousness, and he was so beaten up that he couldn't even speak, but somehow he made it through the night and woke up with them the next morning. So they couldn't stay there because they were in enemy territory, and they never knew when the Lakota Indians might come across their camp and attack them. So the next day, Hugh's friends made like a makeshift stretcher to carry Hugh on, thinking that he would die on the road. But after carrying him along all that day, and then letting him sit overnight, and then carrying him all the next day, and all the next day, still, Hugh didn't die. He was just sitting there fading in and out of consciousness, not eating anything, not drinking anything, just kind of sitting there, not dying. But the unfortunate fact was that this temporary carrying of Hugh had only been meant to be a temporary situation for maybe a couple of hours waiting for him to die because they didn't want to leave him. But in reality, Hugh was just slowing them down way too much. So the leader of the group asked for 2 volunteers who would be willing to stay behind with Hugh for a little while and wait for him to die, and then they could just meet up with the rest of the group later whenever Hugh had passed away. And the leader of the group offered an $80 bonus to whoever volunteered to stay behind with Hugh. And keep in mind that in that time, $80 would be about $2,000 in today's value. So, excited by the prospect of this $2,000 prize and also wanting to be with their friend, 2 men named Bridger and Franz Fitzgerald would stay behind with Hugh as he died. And so, as the rest of the men went on ahead, Bridger and Franz Fitzgerald would make a fire and lay Hugh next to it, and then they would just kind of sit around and wait for him to die. And that's what they did. They sat around and they waited, and they waited, and they waited, but still, Hugh didn't die. And Bridger and Fitzgerald just couldn't believe it. I mean, the man had holes in his throat. His scalp was halfway ripped off. He had broken legs and broken arms and gashes all over his body. They couldn't believe he hadn't just died of blood loss at this point. And after an additional 5 days of waiting, Bridger and Fitzgerald had a tough decision to make, because they were still in enemy territory and they had no idea when the Lakota were going to come across their camp. But they did know that if they stayed there too long, the Lakota would find them eventually. And they were basically just sitting there risking their lives over a man who was dead anyway. And so on the 5th day, Franz Fitzgerald was the one to make the call that they were going to go ahead and leave Hugh behind. So Bridger and Fitzgerald would pick up Hugh and take him down and leave him next to a creek. And then, since a dead man doesn't really need any gear, they would take all of his gear and all of his emergency supplies, and they would take his rifle, and then they would leave Hugh behind and continue on their way to go catch up with the other guys. And when these 2 guys met up with the other guys, they would report that Hugh had died in his sleep, and then they would go on to collect their $80 or $2,000 compensation for staying behind with Hugh. But, of course, Hugh wasn't dead. After laying down next to that creek for a completely unknown amount of time, eventually Hugh would wake up and he would realize that his friends had abandoned him. They had taken all of his gear, they had taken his rifle, and he was just kind of left for dead laying next to this creek. And laying there, Hugh couldn't believe that his friends had abandoned him. But now, what was he going to do? He had no gear, no equipment, and when he tried to move, the pain was just excruciating in every part of his body. So all he could do was kind of maneuver himself in the creek to where he could dip his face in the water and take a drink of water, and then he would just take a drink of water and then he would just lose consciousness. And that's how Hugh spent multiple days, just kind of sipping a little bit of water and regaining some strength and then losing consciousness and waking back up, drinking some water and losing consciousness. But then after a while, he was awake and oriented enough to realize that he had to move or he was going to die. And so through all of the pain, he forced himself to get up and began to crawl his way out of this ravine that his friends had put him in. And then after bandaging up some of his wounds as best as he could, he began to crawl his way towards the way which he knew civilization was, even though Hugh knew that he was heading towards Fort Kiowa, which was more than 200 miles away from his current location. But that's what Hugh would do. Completely determined to survive, he would begin to crawl his way through this mountainous terrain, surviving on bugs and snakes that he would find on the ground to give himself enough protein to continue little by little. And luckily, at one point while he was traveling, he would actually look up in the distance and he saw a bunch of wolves who were devouring a freshly killed buffalo. And so when he saw this, of course, Hugh made his way over to where he could see where these wolves were, and then he just kind of sat there and waited for the wolves to leave and lose interest in this buffalo carcass, and then he went over there and began to gorge himself in this raw meat. I'm sure after days of eating snakes and bugs, this raw buffalo meat was probably one of the best things he had ever eaten. And then after consuming as much of this meat as he could eat, Hugh would rest up for a little bit and try to get more of his strength back, and then for days and weeks he would set off once again, crawling his way through the wilderness. And eventually his crawling would make its way into very slow walking as he made his way through the terrain. And Hugh had bandaged up most of the wounds as best as he possibly could, but Hugh knew that some of his deeper wounds, especially on his back, could get infected with gangrene, which in severe cases could lead to blood poisoning. So what Hugh would do is he would take some of his deeper wounds and he would purposely leave them exposed, allowing maggots to hatch inside of the flesh. And these maggots would take to eating away at the rotting flesh, which would prevent gangrene and stop him from getting blood poisoning. And still, with rudimentary bandages all over his body and maggots literally eating his flesh alive, Hugh continued to walk up mountains and through valleys and across rivers, completely determined on doing whatever he could to survive. And second to survival, Hugh wanted to make his way to civilization, and he wanted to find those two men who had left him for dead, Bridger and Fitzgerald, because he wanted to walk over to them and shake their hand. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. He wanted to kill them. He was completely furious that they had left him to die, but even more than that, he was furious that they had taken his hunting rifle. Not only could he definitely have used that rifle in order to better survive, being able to use it for hunting while he was on his trip, but also for a professional hunter and trapper like Hugh, his rifle was his livelihood. It was how he got his own food, it was how he supported himself, and it was how he made money. So really, that rifle was worth more to Hugh than like an expensive tractor or $80,000 truck would be worth for a farmer today. And so, after weeks of traveling through the wilderness, Hugh eventually made it to the Yellowstone River, where he knew he could follow that river to civilization. Now forgive me, because this story is hundreds of years old, there is a few different accounts of what actually happened when Hugh got to the Yellowstone River. So either Hugh was able to use animal hides and sticks to make himself a raft to float down the river, or it's possible he came across some friendly Lakota who gave him a raft in order to float down the river. Personally, I would like to think it was the friendly Lakota, because Hugh already knew the language and had spent time with the Pawnee Indians, so he kind of knew the culture and was able to talk to them. So it would be a nice thought to think that Hugh was able to find some friendly Lakota who were able to help him on his journey. But of course, that's just me. Either way, he was able to obtain a raft where he would float his way down the Yellowstone River and eventually come to Fort Kiowa, where he would actually make a full recovery. So Hugh had done it. He had literally survived for more than 6 weeks in the treacherous wilderness after surviving this horrific bear attack, literally breathing out of a hole in his neck while maggots ate away at his flesh. And after making his full recovery, Hugh would actually find and track down Bridger, one of the men who had left him behind, but he would actually forgive Bridger and wouldn't kill him because he would find out that it was actually Fitzgerald who was the one who had taken his hunting rifle and had made that final call to leave him behind. And Hugh would also track down Fitzgerald, but he unfortunately wasn't able to kill him either, because by this time, Fitzgerald was actually in the US military, and apparently it's like a rule that you're not supposed to kill soldiers. But when he did find and confront Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald was like, sorry bro, here, do you want your rifle back? Sorry I kinda left you to die. I really didn't think you were ever gonna survive, and I really kind of only stayed for this $80 compensation. So awkward. So anyway, Hugh didn't kill anybody out of revenge, but I'm sure he and Fitzgerald weren't really homies anymore. But after getting his hunting rifle back, he now had back his livelihood, and he went back to work, working as a hunter and a trapper. And this is what he would do for another 10 years until he would eventually run into another group of Lakota, and this time they wouldn't shoot him in the leg or give him a free raft. This time they would kill him. And that is pretty much all we know about the life of Hugh Glass. So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching this episode of Storyvault. If you like this episode, please let me know down in the comments, because this is kind of a different style of episode from what I usually do. Next week's case will be an insane true crime case that was actually suggested to me by a subscriber, so I do listen to your guys' suggestions. But I also wanted to test out this kind of story because these are stories that don't really get told very often and I think are quite interesting. If you're interested, there's actually a movie that was made about the life of Hugh Glass called The Revenant. I have personally not seen this movie and I've heard it's not super accurate, so let me know how this story compares with it if you've seen that movie or if you go watch it. I mean, even if it's not super accurate, I mean, it's Leonardo DiCaprio, so yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching and I'll see you soon. But until then,
Darling,
be safe out there.
turn around. It's me. Follow my voice. Everything's going to be okay, my love. Everything will be fine. It's all over now.